Historians of Reddit, what's a devastating event that no one talks about? Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States, and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge, and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt, but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. This is fairly recent, started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since WW2 with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. Glad to see this post getting so much attention. As some of you mentioned, a lot of African history is overlooked, so here are a few more 20th century African conflicts to look into. If you are interested: Boer Wars, Mau Uprising, Rhodesian Bush War, First and Second Liberian Civil War, Sierra Leone Civil War, Angolan Civil War, First and Second Sudanese Civil War, Somali Civil War, Eritrean Ethiopian War, Congo Crisis, Nigerian Civil War. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them, where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world, and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. Holy shit, I did not expect my comment to blow up. Thanks for all the awards and support, guys. Feel free to follow or message me for either geeky epidemiology, factoids, or NSFW content. I love chatting and meeting new people. During WW2, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Adu. On the island was the village of Adu, where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were the wife, school teacher, and priest's husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in POW camps, where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier POW and almost subhuman, because they didn't fight back, and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived, and they went back home, only to find their village burned down. They left the island, and it now remains uninhabited, basically, driving the Adu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to apologize to the descendants of the Adu tribe they destroyed. When my mom was in college, she had a Cambodian classmate who was studying with her, while his wife and child stayed in Cambodia. When shit started going down, he insisted on returning to Cambodia to get his family out. My mom begged him not to go, and my dad, who was dating my mom at the time and had returned from serving in the Vietnam War just a few years earlier, even offered to go instead to try to get them out. He went anyway. As soon as my mom heard that they were killing the educated people and folks with glasses, she knew she would never see her friend again. He wore glasses. Before he left, he gifted my mom charcoal rubbings he took at Angkor Wat. They are treasured by her to this day, and the only physical evidence she has that her friend existed. I grew up hearing this story. We remember him and his family and pray for them. We may be the only living people who remember them. This was long before I was born, but I will carry his story after my mom passes. We owe it to each other. My friend's mom survived the genocide by hiding in corpse piles during daytime to avoid patrols and traveling only at night. That's as much as she'll share with anyone because of how traumatic it was. Another friend's dad was an AVRN Ranger trained by the USSF RGR, and after escaping a POW camp at the end of the Vietnam War, himself and several other soldiers helped ferry Cambodian refugees into Thailand, while waging guerrilla warfare on the Khmer Rouge along the way. He said the killing fields was worse than anything he saw fighting in his home of Vietnam. I don't know if this was part of a larger organized effort, or an isolated incident of a small band of soldiers who wanted to do something heroic. I can't verify if these things actually happened or the story simply hasn't been told yet, since I can't find any historic writings about it to back up his story. In 535, humans went through hell. Many reported a strange color in the skies. Not just in Europe, a dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions, now known as the Americas, weren't spared, e.g., drought in Peru. Temperatures were rather low in some places. It snowed either in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast, even in the noon. It has been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago, 1903, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single-building fire in US history, where patrons died after sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire. Then a chain reaction started, exacerbated by failures of the things in place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside, as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled down stairs, trampled each other, and got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died, many were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid with city corruption, etc. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. The Andijan Massacre of 2005 in Uzbekistan. It is largest mass shooting in Asia since Tiananmen Square, with over 1,000 killed and even more wounded. The Uzbek government forcefully silenced reform protests by firing into the crowd and then kicked out 90% of Westerners in the country when the US Gov and UN tried to investigate. Terrible loss of life that rarely gets remembered because the Uzbek government tried so hard to cover it up. I know this because my family was one of the many permanently kicked out when I was 2 years old. There's so many that I would go with that will probably be mentioned in other comments, but I think any stories about workers in the early 1900s are pretty horrible. Radium Girls is a pretty horrible event, for example. After being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip. Some also painted their fingernails, face and teeth with the glowing substance. The women were instructed to point their brushes in this way because using rags or water rinse caused them to use more time and material, as the rinse was made from powdered radium, gum arabic and water. Many women died and became sick with horrendous diseases. One woman named Molly Maggie had her jawbone crumble. You can read about that here by May. Her dentist thought Molly needed surgery to remove a fast-growing abscess he found on her jaw. When he got the gums open, the bone didn't look right as it was too ashy and gray, so he gently prodded it with his finger. To his shock and horror, the whole bone crumbled under his fingertip like ashes in a fireplace. Instead of removing a tumor, he wound up digging Molly's entire left jaw out with nothing but his fingers. Unbeknownst to him, the radium had perforated the bone cells and stripped them of calcium. It had, like a little machine gun, shredded the collagen inside the bone and left it as little more than a pile of splinters. There's also a great book on this called The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of American Shining Women by Kate Moore. This whole story is extremely depressing. Work in the 1800s and early 1900s was pretty horrible for a lot of women, men and children. Brew wenches, female miners in the 19th century, you can look that up, children in chimney sweeps, etc. I talked about this on a similar prompt a month or so ago, but I think people should know about this event, so I'm copying and pasting it again here. The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of March 18, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, Texas turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas, and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion, so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it, other than the fact that he'd survived until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated, so my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his, actually very interesting, life, including a big section on the New London school explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. He was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything, because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I wouldn't go into details, but there were bodies, and parts of bodies, everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed, and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boys started lowering the badly injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. The Carrington event in 1859, solar flares hit the Earth causing an aurora borealis effect to be seen all over the world. It lasted for several days, during which time it was reportedly bright enough to read by at midnight. Telegraph operators reported receiving shocks and burns from the devices, and in some cases, removed the batteries powering the telegraphs, as signals were being disrupted by the geomagnetic storm. After removing the batteries, the telegraph still operated, in some cases better than they had when powered. It wasn't particularly devastating at the time, but it's estimated that if a similar storm were to hit us today, it would cripple the entire planet for potentially decades. The estimated repair cost in the US alone is measured in the trillions. In 2012, a similar storm missed the Earth by 9 days. The Highland Clearances. Over a period of about 150 years between the 18th and 19th centuries, English and Lowland Scottish landlords evicted thousands upon thousands of Highland Scoots from their ancestral homelands and replaced them with sheep. It's hard to classify as a historical event because it went on for so long and is usually interpreted as an ambiguous series of largely isolated incidents. There were attacks on villages in which the landlords would burn their tenants' houses to the ground to get them to leave and burn their land so that nothing could grow. Multiple people were caught in the fires and died. During the Glencoe massacre, 30 members of Clan MacDonald were murdered by Scottish government forces for supporting the Jacobite uprising. The Irish potato famine also affected the Highland Scoots who grew potatoes, and many people starved or were forced to leave as well. As a result, there was a series of mass migration in which Scoots traveled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. It's very sad, and all that is basically why Highland culture and language has largely been lost. The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate, and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never even having seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them, and their loved ones and totally helpless to do anything about it.